Before we get into any practical tips or techniques on how to be an effective disciple maker, it's important to understand why we believe making disciples is important in the first place. In Matthew chapter 28, Jesus speaks to his disciples and he says, "Go into all the world and make disciples." Jesus is calling us to go into all of the nations and make disciples. And ever since the earliest Christians, there have been followers of Jesus who have been dialoguing and talking about what does it really mean to make disciples. This is a very important conversation that we ought to continue to have. No doubt is a valuable dialogue that we can have here in our contemporary context. However, before we do that, I think it's important to ask the question, what would the first century Jews be thinking when Jesus made this statement? How would a first century Jewish person understand the statement, "Go and make disciples"? Jesus was a Jewish man living amongst Jewish people in first century Jewish culture. And that has a great impact on how we view the scripture. This ought to continually begin to influence how we understand the statements of Jesus. So when Jesus says to his disciples, "Go and make disciples amongst all the nations," we must begin to understand how a Jewish person viewed discipleship. You see, Jesus wasn't the very first person to come up with the idea of discipleship. It had existed in the Jewish culture for several decades, if not several centuries, prior to Jesus showing up on the scene. This was a part of the Jewish rabbinical system of the first century that had developed over the course of a 200-year period leading up to the first century. It was relatively normal for Jewish leaders and Jewish teachers, people that we call rabbis. These rabbis would draft or would recruit young men to be their followers. And when a young man was recruited by a rabbi to be his follower, in essence, that rabbi was telling that young man, "I believe that you have what it takes to live life the way I live life." That rabbi was telling that young man, "I believe that you have what it takes to take my understanding of the scripture and teach it to other people." That rabbi was, in essence, making the statement, you have the wherewithal, the ability, the talents to take my theology, my philosophy, and the things that I have been preaching, and to then continue them after I am gone. The rabbis were seeking to pass the baton, so to speak, to the younger peoples within their region. Their goal was to recruit young men that they could teach, train, mentor, and hand the baton to. Every rabbi had their own set of theological beliefs, their own doctrines, their own ideologies, their own philosophies as to how people should live their lives. They had their own understandings for how humans get connected to God. This was referred to as a yoke. Your yoke was how you believed a person connected to God. The word yoke itself is a metaphor, if you're not familiar. The word yoke refers to a farming tool where you could take two oxen and pair them together to allow them to accomplish a task they otherwise may not be able to accomplish on their own. Jesus comes on the scene and he says that my yoke is easy. Many of the rabbis of the first century, in essence, were teaching a manner to connect to God that, quite frankly, was just too hard. Many of these rabbinical teachers, these Jewish leaders, these Jewish theological teachers of the day were teaching a manner to connect to God, a manner that humans could yoke to God that, quite frankly, was too burdensome and too difficult. They were setting a standard that was simply unrealistic, or in some cases, setting standards that were actually contrary to what God desired, or made it difficult for them to actually have relationship with God. Jesus shows up on the scene and he begins to turn things upside down. He begins to assess or pass judgment on the types of yoke that were being preached or communicated in the first century. This was relatively normal. And again, it didn't start in the first century. It actually had started several generations before. Now, throughout the first century, there were various rabbinical groups, different schools of thought There were different Jewish groups that were teaching different yokes. You had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and others. They had various people with varying theology and various doctrines, and they were seeking to recruit Jewish people to follow their way of believing, their doctrines, their philosophies, and their opinions on how humans ought to connect to God. When Jesus, in essence, is telling his disciples to go make disciples, he is telling them, go recruit people from all parts of the world to be my followers and to teach them my yoke. Jesus is telling us to make disciples. And when he says that, he's telling us, go find people, recruit them to the faith. I apologize if that sounds a bit crass, but in essence, that's what Jesus is saying. Go recruit people, mentor them, train them, and in essence, teach them how I have taught you. The doctrines and theologies that I have taught you to embrace, teach them to embrace those as well. The lifestyle that I have commanded you to live, go teach that to others as well. The way of life that I have modeled for you, I want you now to go model that for them. Jesus is saying to them, I have already given you a yoke, a manner in which you can connect to God. Now what I want you to do is to go to all the nations of the world and go teach them my yoke. In the next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about the heart of discipleship and why we potentially make it more difficult than it ought to be.